Welcome to the Mythic Plus guide for World of Warcraft. We will be covering everything from group and individual role responsibility, how to actually get into keys, the systems of a Mythic Plus run, and more. A table of contents is down below, but if you're not sure where to start, this video is formatted to be coherent from start to finish. And if you want to just know how to actually apply to get into a key, there is a section at the end of the video if you're looking for that. Also, there will be some big changes, potentially Season 2 or Season 3 of the War Within, to the Mythic Plus system. If there are major changes, I will re-upload this video and make all of the corresponding adjustments. That being said, my name is Bowser the Healer. Get subscribed if you like World of Warcraft, and hey, I appreciate you. What is Mythic Plus? Mythic Plus is a form of endgame content alongside Raid, PvP, and Delves. You go into dungeons on the Mythic difficulty and put your keystone into a font of power. That will determine the difficulty of the dungeon. You'll hear throughout this video me say things like +5 or +12. Every plus is another step up in difficulty. More health on enemies, more damage from enemies, and various affixes that get harder as the keystone grows from completed runs. The goal is to clear enough enemy forces, known as mobs or trash, and take out all of the bosses, all within the timer of the dungeon provides. If you clear under time, the keystone levels up. If you fail, you can still get gear, but the keystone will level down. Mythic Plus is essentially co-op speedrunning. Fast-paced dungeons with lots of damage profiles for the DPS to blast through, healing profiles and mistakes for healers to fix, and mobs that need to be managed and respected by tanks. Every role shares responsibilities in dungeons, as well as having their own unique roles, and every class and spec plays differently in Mythic Plus. Classes sometimes change drastically between Raid and Mythic Plus, and while others will stay very familiar in both. Learning Mythic Plus. In order to play Mythic Plus, you will want to have some experience under your belt, but you do not need an expert or even be advanced at the game to play. If you've leveled to 80, maybe run a few delves, then you have what you need to start other than the gear. Let's go over the various things that you can learn from Mythic Plus and take it one step at a time. You don't need to have all of this memorized. Let's start with the affixes. Affixes make keys harder, and as the key level goes up, you will get more of them. At the keystone level 12, they will stop changing and remain the same, although the key level can still go up. At +2, the first level of key, you get the seasonal affix. This hasn't been around since Season 1 of Dragonflight, and in future seasons it might go away again. We don't know. But a seasonal affix will be unique to the season and the story. Season 1 of the War Within, Xal'atath shows up and makes us do something, like collecting orbs, breaking balls, killing some additional enemy. If we do it right, we get a buff. If we fail, the enemies get a buff. This is typically known as a Kiss Curse effect in World of Warcraft. These affixes aren't too hard to do, and if you mess them up in a low key level, the repercussions aren't too bad. But in a higher level key, messing them up can be detrimental. At a +4, Tyrannical or Fortified will turn on. You get one each week and it will swap to the other on the next week. Tyrannical makes the bosses hit harder and have more health. Fortified makes the enemy forces, or the trash as we know them, have more health and deal more damage. At a +7, Challenger's Peril will make dying take 15 seconds off the timer instead of the normal 5, making deaths far more punishing. And at +10, Fortified and Tyrannical will both be online. And while we talk about score in a later section, note that clearing a 10 will count for both your Fortified and your Tyrannical weeks. At a +12, the seasonal affix will actually turn off, and instead the dungeon is a flat 10% harder on top of everything else. Once again, at the lower level keys, the affixes can definitely hurt a run, but they aren't nearly as impactful. As you get into that +7 and beyond territory, you will really start to feel that difficulty, but you'll also tackle harder dungeons with more gear and knowledge. So they're more approachable than you might think. Stick to low-level keys until you're prepared to move up to harder content. More on that later. The dungeons. Before we head into how to learn a dungeon, let's start by just mentioning heroic dungeons are the seasonal dungeons for Mythic Plus now, meaning heroic is kind of a great place to gear up and learn these dungeons for when you're ready to finally go into Mythic Plus. And while we're at it, a +2 is essentially the same difficulty as a Mythic 0 or a non-keystone Mythic dungeon. The +2 just adds the timer and the enemy forces requirement. The dungeons per season used to be the 8 or so dungeons found within an expansion, but as of Shadowlands Season 4, they've expanded to older dungeons as well. Right now, we seem to be in a flow of 4 dungeons from the expansion that's current, and 4 from the past dungeons and expansions. Season 3 of Dragonflight was all past dungeons, and then Season 4 was all Dragonflight dungeons. This could change, but this is likely how that dungeon pool will play out in the War Within. The various dungeons for each season can be found in your Adventurer's Guide, Shift J by default, I believe. While some of the dungeon is easiest learned by playing through the dungeons, bosses are probably the most important thing to learn. Your dungeon journal will actually tell you what each boss does and what to look out for as each role. And the bosses on easier difficulties are of course going to be not too hard, but as your difficulty level goes up and your key level goes up, not only are they doing more damage from that keystone level, but you will also see their mechanics maybe more than once. Maybe you'll see all the mechanics, maybe you'll have to do 2 or 3 rounds of the mechanics. Having a route through the dungeon is also important. There are weekly routes on the website radar.io, which I'll talk about more, but it's where your M+ score is located. Most dungeons, however, have a strat that I like to call the Hold W, where you can just kind of look at the map and take out enemies while running to a boss, and that's usually enough to get started. But many dungeons present you with options, and wasting time on a higher key level can be what fails a run. Early on, Mythic Plus is very flexible. Enemy forces, commonly known as mobs or trash, will also require some learning, but usually these mobs aren't very complicated, so running into them a few times is probably all you need, and you can see what spells hurt the most. If you want to know what's going to be dangerous at a higher level, just think to yourself, if that move hit me 3 times harder, would it kill me? And that's going to be what helps you understand what's going to hurt in like a +10 or a +12. If you're ever feeling confident with your dungeon knowledge, feel free to run a higher key level, but I would never move too past the +5 or +6 category until you are confident and pretty well geared from the dungeons that you've already played. If you're ever watching this guide before the start of a season, things work a little bit differently. Week 1 and week 2, players will go in blind and push their keys up as fast as possible. So if you have good gear and even good score going into a season or an expansion's first Mythic Plus season, you will find you might start hopping up your key level quickly. Find your limits if you do this, and wherever it's comfortable, that's going to be where you want to grind. Team responsibility. This may be the most important part of this video for anyone actually playing Mythic Plus. Everyone has responsibilities in M+, and roles also have more specific responsibilities. But we are going over group responsibility first, as those are the core of Mythic Plus gameplay. The sooner you learn this, the better. First responsibility. Your health bar is your responsibility. The healer is there to fix you up from unavoidable damage and accidents. Use your defensives before the mechanics and the damage hit you. Use your self-heals and dispels after the damage and the effects have gone off. If you have nothing left in your tank, it's up to the healer to keep you alive. Use your health pots, your self-heals, and defensives to survive when the going gets rough and you're worried your healer will not get to you in time. Or if you have something low cooldown like Impending Victory or Crimson File, you can use those often to help take some of the burden away from the healer. Also, healers need to make sure they don't die too. I've seen them worry about others so much and they end up knocking themselves out in the process to do this. So healers, make sure you keep yourself alive. Next responsibility. Everyone must control mobs. There are 2 kinds of controls, crowd control and interrupts, also known as kicks. Crowd control are all things from soft CCs like slows and roots to hard CC like stuns or sleeps. When it comes to soft CC, you might be slowing an enemy that's fixated, chasing after a teammate, or rooting a mob so that it doesn't walk into you all when you're in the middle of a fight. But we're really talking about hard CC when we're talking about what we call stops. Hard CC are things like stuns, sleeps, disorients, knockups, and more. Anything that is also likely to stop a spell cast bars, or certain abilities. When a mob is hard CC, it either can't attack or do damage, or it can't do more than auto attack. We call this a stop because it stops a move. The tanks will usually lead the stops of a pull, but it's on everyone to prevent moves from going off, especially ones that would be lethal to the party members. But there's another way a move can be stopped. Interrupts, also known as kicks, are abilities that specifically say they either silence or prevent a school of magic from being cast. So if an enemy fire mage is casting a fire spell and you kick their fire spell with your interrupt, it will lock them out of said school of magic for a time. This is usually called like fire lock. This forces mobs to either swap schools of magic or, if unable to, start walking into auto attack. It's critical to interrupt moves to prevent incoming damage, but it's also good for organizing the mobs. Some moves are more important than others to interrupt, and sometimes you'll find that a stop doesn't put a move on cooldown, and you must interrupt to get the enemy to actually stop casting the move for a little bit. And mobs that can't be crowd controlled might be kickable. If a move is kickable, it is a colorful and oftentimes yellow cast bar. If a move can't be kicked, it will be gray or silver. Some mobs that can be CC'd can't be kicked, but can be stopped, and of course, vice versa. Next responsibility. Everyone needs to do mechanics. There are fights and mobs where maybe there's one person who's the best pick for the job, but there are times where your healer has their hands occupied, or a tank can't move anymore, and it's up to everyone else to get their back. Mechanics are anything that goes off in a fight or even in a dungeon, from swirlies to having to solve a maze, removing a curse off you with a black hole, or even jacuzzi bosses that can't move but need something in range, or they'll probably wipe the whole party. And as a final responsibility, everyone must fight. When you don't have a personal responsibility left like healing, mechanics, etc., it's time to blast. Healers do damage, tanks try to optimize as much as they can, and DPS are playing to their specs abilities. I'll talk more about all of this in the individual section coming up, but especially to any healers I just scared, I promise you, I got you. Let's talk individual role responsibility. However, if you didn't watch the last section talking about team responsibility, that is the most important thing you can ever learn in Mythic Plus, so make sure you've at least checked that out. Tanks. Your job is to have a basic route, or at least lead the group along the route. Trust you are sometimes just making it up, but you're the opener. You will generally be the one to pull the enemies with your attacks, get threats on them, and keep the team safe. Threat and survival are the most important things to you. If you don't do enough damage, threat means that enemies won't be looking at you, they'll be looking at your DPS and healer. If you're not managing your active cooldown mitigation tools and your cooldowns, you might get flattened. It's a really tough balance, but every single tank has active mitigation, their standard defensive tools, and their cooldowns. Bigger buttons to rotate in and out of pulls to either stay alive or to do more damage and establish more threat. I did mention this earlier, but you also set the stop and kick pacing. When you open a pull, feel free to be the opening crowd control in kicks, and then save maybe your next potential kick for an important spell that you know you want to stop. DPS. Your job is obviously to do damage, but it's a lot more nuanced than that. DPS have profiles of damage, outside of Augmentation Evoker, and if you want to learn more about that spec, I have an hour-and-a-half guide on that. In Mythic Plus, you want to have a good area of effect build or damage setup because you're typically not fighting one mob, you're fighting multiple mobs at a time. But sometimes you do end up with a pack of one mob or a boss, 2 to 3 mobs, or a bazillion mobs. Sometimes there's an enemy that's stronger than the rest of the pack that has more health, and not every DPS is good at dealing with AoE or priority damage, etc. So every DPS needs to know what damage profile they're good at. The standard damage profiles are single target, 2 to 3 target cleave, 4 to 5 target AoE, and then massive AoE. There's also priority target. As an example, Shadow Priests do damage through their Psychic Link. Shadow Crash will hit 8 enemies with Vampiric Touch to provide this Psychic Link for damage. And while you can manually target more enemies with Vampiric Touch for more AoE, how worth it is it to set that up when you could already be doing damage to the 8 targets that you've already hit? Arms Warrior has Sweeping Strikes, which makes their single target moves hit 2 targets instead of 1. There is a breakpoint where the move Cleave would be stronger in AoE than their single target move Mortal Strike hitting 2 targets. Depending on the target count, their tier set, and etc., this one might change which move is more important and when. And of course, when Sweeping Strikes goes down, you'll also change your button priority again. This list goes on forever, and every single DPS can think about this. One high-level technique is called funneling, which allows you to get your DPS resources on multiple enemies and funnel them into one target. Feral Druid has an ability that allows their bleeds to give them a chance at a free bite, their strongest single target attack. So they can make multiple enemies bleed and then get more procs on bites that they can all put into a single priority target, like a higher health mob. Study your spec and learn where your tools go and what you're good at. And while you're looking at your tools, don't forget about your dispels, your healing, and your defensives while you're at it. Healers. I might have scared you earlier, but let's start with the basics. Triage. Triage is the concept of who you can save and who you can't save. Sometimes when the going gets rough, you need to pick who can live and who's gonna die. You and the tank are two of the most important targets to keep alive, followed by anybody with a battle resurrection ability. Tanks will need your help sometimes, but the tank is 80% of the time going to be fine on their own. So if the tank is looking okay, you can focus on yourself and the DPS more. If a tank requires too much healing from the healer, either they're going through some crazy damage mechanic, or the healer's going to start running out of resources, and then the DPS that need to be healed will likely be in danger. It's not mana efficient to heal your tank forever. And much like DPS, you actually have healing profiles and cooldowns. Are you healing one person, 2 to 3 target cleave, or many people? Each healer manages this kind of healing differently, usually with a limited amount of AoE healing. You also have cooldowns that can be used to either make it through a tough bit of healing, or what I like to call emergency cooldowns that can save lives when the going gets rough. You will learn as the dungeons get harder where you can save on healing cooldowns and mana, and when you need to send your resources to keep people alive. If the damage was unreactable and someone died or almost died instantly, it was likely a mechanic, a needed kick or stop, or something that was avoidable that they stood in. And don't take those personally, it's not always directly your fault. One recommendation is using the add-on details, which is typically a damage meter. You can set it to check deaths or damage taken. This can at a glance give you an idea of what's happening to your teammates and what moves are dodgeable versus undodgeable, and you'll understand if it's the pugs standing in circles or if you might have missed a heal on a homie who absolutely needed you. Healer DPS is important. If I get another comment telling me how it isn't, so help me God. Healers can take minutes off a run, seconds off priority targets, etc. Healer damage is also usually not complicated. If you're new, just throw damage out whenever you can and truly never stress about it. But if you're in that +7 or beyond key level, I'm going to be the meanie who says it. You should absolutely know how to do your damage as a healer and send it when you can. Because sometimes you can't though. The world's on fire and you gotta be healing. But trust me, as you get confident and comfortable, the damage will come. You just don't actually heal every second of a run at higher levels. And all the damage that you can do is still time save. We always want that as a team. Anything you can do helps. Healing first, damage second. Bowser, what is score? You're often going to hear me talk about score or other players. Mythic Plus is tracked with a score for how well you've done in dungeons, purely based on how fast you clear. Raider.io is a website that works with Blizzard as a partner to track these scores, letting you check out how well you're doing. I am not sponsored by Raider.io, but I was on their front page recently and I absolutely love the people who work over there. That score is in-game as well as on the website. Score also is what people look at when you apply to keys or post your key. We get to know how much score you have, what your best runs are for that dungeon, and what your gear score or item level is. Let's talk about understanding player expectations. The difficulty of Mythic Plus goes up as high as you want it to go. There's nothing wrong with sticking to low keys while you're learning, or if that's just what you enjoy. If you want to push yourself, I have some tips coming up for that. But as the key level goes up, there's more expectation, so you know what you're doing. So let me help you figure out the numbers and the item levels of keys and expectations from other players. Now, I just want to note this section is entirely biased in my own opinion, but as someone who pugs almost every day of their life, I have a really good grasp on this stuff and I want to share as much as I can. When it comes to key levels 2 through 5, that's beginner territory. It's okay to learn here. I recommend having at least done every key at a 2 to 3 before going to maybe 4s and 5s, as 4s when tyrannical or fortified starts to apply and the difficulty goes up quite a bit. Key level 6 through 7 is my license test key level. You know the keys, you know most of the mechanics, and you're comfortable with your spec and your role. Players will expect that you know how to interrupt and stop incoming damage. If you don't at this level, you might burn out taking too much damage as a team. 8s, but mostly 9s, are what I like to call the high-end gate. If you can clear all the dungeons on a 9, you're ready for the next big challenge of a 10. Players will expect not only good mechanics, but good damage and a more competitive item level. Whatever the higher end for the season is, they're going to want to see you getting closer to that. In Season 1 of The War Within, 615 and up is kind of what I look for out of 9. Some people are pickier and look for higher, but you can get away with keys at lower key levels, but it's not about if you can do it, it's about if the team you're applying for will actually take you. 10s will give you a portal to the dungeon if you time them, but Fortified and Tyrannical will both be online. So it's the ultimate test of performing both weeks of difficulty. Players expect the same from you from 9s, but with even more perfection. You can't wipe or die too often at this key level, and 10s will really punish you for it. 12s is the next big gate. Players will want to see you have done all the keys on 11 before they even start taking you into 12s. Perfection is sort of mandatory here. I want you to think 90 to 95% of this dungeon has to go great. Item level. This is going to change from season to season, but here's the short version. Heroic dungeons should get you geared for Mythic Plus. If you have mostly heroic gear on, you're probably good. And whatever item level that is, probably the top of adventure or the bottom of veteran gear is about where you want to be. Now, just so we're clear, you can run Mythic Plus on a pretty low item level. We're going to talk about that in a second, but players do expect to see a decent amount of gear on you. If you're fully kitted out in all hero gear that's fully upgraded, a plus 10 for a mid-core player is going to be on the breezier side, so gear score really does make a difference. However, let's be honest, 70% of Mythic Plus is going to be skill early on, and only 30% of it's going to be gear. Within a season, a plus 10 this season can be cleared at 608 item level. I know because I'm pretty sure that's when I cleared it. That being said, most pugs aren't going to see you in 608 gear and go, oh yeah, they can run a 10. The expectation of the players is that you're putting in the work. So having a decent gear score is also useful, just like having a good dungeon score. So while you might be running a lot of keys early on to get that initial score, you're eventually going to want to have enough gear that players aren't worried you're just going to fall over in a dungeon run. All right, let's talk about add-ons. I don't want to spend too much time here because I have an entire interface video, but there are 3 I want to talk about. First of all, Raider.io has their own add-on. This just lets you see a bunch of extra detail on people, like what scores they have. You might be able to see what their main score is if they're on an alt. Very useful information. Details I mentioned earlier, as well as just a DPS meter. You can also use it to track things like healing done, or if anyone in your party is actually interrupting any spells. There's a lot of very useful information here. In healers, I highly recommend details, just so you can check data like why people are dying or what kind of damage they're taking, so you can become a better healer or not be gaslit by the pugs who are telling you that you're not healing them when they're standing in a swirly. Then there's another add-on that you have some choices of, Deadly Boss Mods or Big Wigs and Little Wigs. I'm currently on Little Wigs and Big Wigs because I really like the default out-of-the-box experience, but these add-ons will call out mechanics to let you know what's going on. It doesn't play the game for you, it simply adds audio cues to things. DBM will default to voiceovers, while Big Wigs and Little Wigs will default to sound effects. I don't care how good you are at this game, reducing cognitive load by any amount is going to be useful for any player, and we see that across all of esports and competitive gaming. They're also extremely customizable, so you can have it change certain alerts or notify you when a spell's about to go off in case you're, say, playing Discipline Priest and you want to give yourself a little bit of a ramp window. You can set an alert up to help remind you, hey, I should start ramping right now. Very useful stuff. Okay, this section we're going to go over how you actually apply for a Mythic Plus key or host your own key. I'm going to go over everything here and I'm going to try to have all the relevant footage, so bear with me. Before we even apply to a key, this is a good time to get consumables, right? If you're at a key level, I would say +7 and beyond, that's probably the time to start bringing consumables to a dungeon. Not going to go over consumables, and if you're new to the game or doing lower level keys, you really don't need to be wasting gold on more things, so don't even worry about food until a little bit later in your journey. So let's get our consumables, and now it's time to Group Finder. If we're posting our own key, simply create a group in the Group Finder page, which I want to say its default is I or O. I can't remember what button I'm pressing. You're going to just go to Dungeons, start a group, and it will probably automatically try to list your key, but make sure it's a Mythic Plus keystone, make sure the dungeon's correct, and that the level difficulty is correct. Most players will write the dungeon number here or plus, and then whatever your keystone is, post the group, and then players will start showing up and you can start forming your team. If you're applying for a group, it's a similar process, but you look for groups, you search, and then you can use the search bar to, like, say, search certain parameters like different difficulty keystones or a specific keystone that you want to run. You can apply up to 5 groups, and when it comes to hosting or joining a key, you do kind of want to think about group composition. Early on, don't even worry about this, but of course you want 1 tank, 3 DPS, and a healer. Typically speaking, you want 1 battle res, and a bloodlust. And of course, if you're a tank or a healer and the group already has a tank or a healer, or you're a DPS and the group already has 3 DPS, then you probably shouldn't even apply for the key. Once you've applied to keys or you've posted a key and you've gathered your players together, say hello when you join, and it's time to go to the dungeon. If the dungeon is in current expansion, you'll likely have to actually fly to the dungeon, so go do that. Otherwise, you can go over here to when Lindormi is, and you can either talk to her to lower your keystone level, or go through the portal to go to one of the areas where the old dungeons are located. Once you make it to the dungeon, use the summoning stone to gather your allies for the party, and then head on in, and it's time to get ready. If you're hosting a key, you're going to do things a little differently here, but make sure everyone's inside. Once everyone's inside, use any consumables you want to have prepped before the run. If you're hosting, you're going to use the little side menu to initiate a ready check, and just make sure that everyone's ready to go. Then, when everyone's ready, click on the font of power, put your keystone in, and then on that little menu, start a countdown timer. Players have pre-pulls that they want to use before the dungeon starts. This allows them to time it. Once you hit 00 on the timer or you hear the ding, hit the button and start the run. Do note that a lot of players expect this countdown timer, and a lot of people lose confidence in the run when they don't see a countdown timer, as it shows a player who isn't familiar with Mythic Plus. While I'm normally for breaking tradition, this is one that I think is pretty safe to go for. Please try to always do a countdown timer after a ready check to assure that all your players are on the same page. Get in there and start blasting. The tank's going to lead, the DPS are going to do damage, and the healer will keep people upright and do damage whenever they can. My only tips for you at this point is to have fun, use your damage cooldowns as often as you can, and learn. There are many players you can watch, guides you can reference to learn more about Mythic Plus. Check Twitch, check YouTube, and maybe just watch some top players do some runs and have some fun. And finally, go get your ass kicked. WoW is an incredibly tough game. It might start on the easier side, but learn, make mistakes, make friends, and have a wonderful time. If you have performance anxiety and you're worried about how others might treat you, I have a wonderful video linked below about that topic that I've poured my heart and soul into, and I hope it helps. Trust me, this kind of content, once you get the hang of it, I think it's some seriously peak MMO endgame. Push the limits, learn, and have a great time. That's going to do it for this one. If you have any other questions about Mythic Plus, feel free to drop them below. And of course, on Twitch, Bowser the Healer, all one word, I'll always try to talk to new people who show up whenever I can, maybe help them with the Mythic Plus journey. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.